A quiet country vet saves a bleeding stranger on a storm-torn night, only to discover he's the most feared mafia boss in the East. Now hunted by his enemies, tied to his secrets, and torn between fear and an unspoken bond, she must decide. Will she save the man who dragged her into his war, or walk away before the wolves at his door come for her too? Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments below. A bitter wind rattled the windows of the small wooden clinic as rain slashed sideways through the black wilderness, the storm's roar drowning the whisper of the pine forest beyond. Inside, Dr. Elise Vance moved with the weary precision of habit, locking cabinets, dimming the last lamp, and glancing at Jax, the scar-faced shepherd mix curled near the heater, yet keeping one amber eye on her, as if sensing the night held more than thunder. She had come to this remote corner of Washington to escape the ghosts of a trauma ward in Seattle, to trade the screams of ER sirens for the soft whimper of injured strays. Yet as the storm grew heavier, she felt that old coil of tension tightening in her chest, a premonition she tried to ignore while wiping her hands on a towel that still smelled faintly of antiseptic, when suddenly the front door shook under a violent pounding, sharp enough to cut through the wail of the wind. Jax leapt up with a deep, warning growl, hackles raised, while Elisa's heart hammered as she crossed the narrow reception room, every creak of the wooden floor echoing the surge of dread in her blood. And when she pulled the door open, the gale shoved a spray of rain into her face, along with the sight of a man on the threshold, tall, broad-shouldered, half-slumped against the frame, his dark shirt plastered to his skin and streaked with blood that the rain could not wash away, his pale blue eyes burning with both fever and a strange controlled alertness that made her breath catch. For a moment the world seemed to narrow to those eyes and the hoarse rasp of his voice. "No hospitals. Please. They'll find me there." Words broken by pain, but carrying a command that froze her where she stood, torn between the instincts of a physician sworn to preserve life and the bone-deep warning that this man was not the sort whose life came without danger attached. Another peal of the under rolled above the clinic, startling her back into motion, and with a sharp whistle she quieted Jax, whose growl subsided to a low rumble as if in reluctant acknowledgement. Then she stepped aside and let the stranger stumble across her threshold, feeling at once as if she had opened her door to a storm more dangerous than the one outside. The clinic smelled of iodine and damp fur as she guided him to the stainless steel exam table, her fingers steady though her pulse was not, fetching her veterinary suture kit, scissors, sterile gauze, tools meant for saving animals, but now the only barrier between this bleeding man and death, while he sat rigid, jaw clenched, as if refusing to surrender to weakness, his breath shallow from the wound in his side that seeped darkly through the fabric each time he shifted. She worked quickly, cutting the shirt open to expose the torn flesh beneath, rainwater dripping from his hair onto the floor, his muscles coiled like a predator's even in pain. And when she pressed a cloth to staunch the bleeding, he let out a hiss, eyes locked on hers as though measuring her resolve. Jax crept closer, head low, then in a move that startled Elise more than the gunshot wound itself, the old dog settled beside the stranger's boot and rested his chin there, watching her intently as if to say, "This one is worth saving," and something in that quiet canine verdict eased the knot in her chest, though it left her more unsettled than before. She stitched the wound in silence except for the crackle of the storm and the soft rasp of his breathing, aware of the raw strength under her hands and the faint tremor that betrayed how close he had been to collapse, yet he never complained, only once whispering a strained "thank you" that felt more dangerous than any threat. Just as she knotted the last suture and reached for the bandage, the distant whine of an engine dry fitted through the rain, followed by the slow sweep of headlights sliding across the clinic's window, and she felt the man's whole body tense beneath her touch, his gaze snapping to the door with sudden, feral alertness as he rasped, barely louder than the storm, "They're hunting me." And in that moment Elise realized that by letting him in she had not merely saved a stranger's life. She had stepped, perhaps irrevocably, into the path of whatever hunted him. Dawn crept reluctantly over the drenched forest, a pale gray light struggling through the mist and rain-soaked pines, as Elise stood by the clinic's kitchen window, hands clenched around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold, her eyes tracing the fog-veiled road where tire tracks were already filling with puddles. And behind her, the low crackle of the old wood-burning stove sounded like a heartbeat trying to steady her nerves. In the exam room down the short hall, the man she had saved lay stretched on the cot she used for injured shepherds, silent but awake, those pale eyes open to the ceiling as if listening to things she could not hear. And when Jax padded in to nudge Elise's knee, she knelt to stroke the dog's head and whispered to herself that as soon as the rain let up, the stranger had to go, that whatever trouble stalked him would not be allowed to plant its roots in the fragile peace she had built here. But as she turned back, she found Sonder leaning against the doorframe, his face drawn but his posture steady despite the fresh bandage under his shirt. And when she told him he needed to leave, her voice sharper than she intended, he tilted his head as if weighing her, then opened his mouth to answer. But a distant engine growled up the muddy road before a word left his lips, and the sound made both their heads snap toward the window, where through the thin veil of morning mist, a black SUV rolled slowly into view, its headlights like watchful eyes cutting through the gray. Elise felt her pulse leap and gestured for him to move, pushing him toward the supply room at the back, while Jax bristled and padded ahead of them, hackles rising again, the dog's instincts always one step ahead of her reason. She barely had time to shove the door closed behind Sonder before 3 men stepped through the clinic's front entrance without waiting to be invited, heavy boots scattering droplets of rain across the worn wooden floor, their dark coats smelling faintly of gun oil and wet asphalt, their accents rough and foreign as the tallest produced a creased, blurred photograph that caught the weak morning light and announced in a clipped tone they were searching for a dangerous fugitive who had been seen on the forest road the previous night. Elise's heartbeat drummed in her ears, but she forced her fingers to unclench from the hem of her sweater, raised her chin as if affronted by the intrusion, and said she had seen no one but a wounded fox she had treated at midnight, her voice even and cool despite the tremor threatening her breath. And Jax at her side played his part by giving a single low growl that drew the men's attention away from the hallway door she was desperate to keep between them and the truth. The men exchanged skeptical glances. One of them sniffed as though smelling lies on the air. Then the leader muttered something in his own language, pocketed the photograph, and after a long, assessing stare that made the back of her neck prickle, he signaled to the others and they left, the door closing behind them with a dull thud that seemed louder than the storm had the night before. Elise sagged against the counter for a breathless moment, feeling the aftershock of her own courage, then heard the soft scuff of boots, and turned to see Sonder emerge from the back room's shadows, shoulders still squared, but eyes fixed on her with something unreadable, approval, maybe, or gratitude held too tightly to speak, until at last he said in a voice low and rough from more than pain, "If you hadn't lied. Just now, you'd already be dead." And the truth in that quiet warning made her shiver despite the rising sun's feeble warmth. She wanted to demand answers, to push him out the door, but something in his steady gaze stole the words from her tongue, so she turned away to busy her hands with cleaning instruments that did not need cleaning, while he stood silent a moment longer before pulling a sleek black phone from his pocket, its screen cracked but still glowing, and as he glanced down, a flicker of tension sharpened his features, the kind of reaction that made her stomach knot, even before he showed her the screen where a single word pulsed like a wound. Betrayed. And as the rumble of the departing SUV faded into the forest road, Elise realized the quiet she had fought so hard to build was not simply broken. It had been marked, and the storm that had delivered the bleeding stranger to her door had only just begun to close its jaws. The message betrayed still burned like a brand on Sonder's phone screen as dusk bled into night, and while Elise tried to focus on restocking bandages in the small back room of her clinic, her mind kept circling the silence that had settled over the house like an uninvited guest. Later, long after she thought Sonder had fallen asleep on the cot she had prepared for him, She heard the soft crunch of tires on the gravel outside, followed by the almost imperceptible creak of the side door, and curiosity pulled her to the crack of the doorway where shadows stretched across the narrow hall, her pulse quickening when she recognized the low, measured voice of Saunders speaking to someone unseen. The newcomer, a tall figure cloaked in the dim glow of the porch light, stepped closer, his words sharp yet deferential as he addressed Saunders with a title that made Elise's stomach knot. Boss. The single word tumbling into the stillness like a stone into deep water, its ripples reaching her in a shiver that tightened her grip on the doorframe. And as the man stepped fully into the kitchen, light Elise saw the hard planes of his face and the silver scar, lysing across his cheek, a mark that seemed to belong to a life of violence, while Saunders, with his arm still bound from his wound, stood like a commander who had never been broken. She strained to catch their conversation and heard the lieutenant, Silas Grant, speak of loyalty tested, of factions shifting, of the bloody trail left by those who had hunted their own, and Elise's breath hitched when she realized that the man she had been protecting was not merely some hunted criminal, but the leader of the very syndicate the news had called a phantom empire. The wooden floor groaned beneath her foot, betraying her presence, and when both men turned their heads toward the hallway, she stepped forward rather than retreat, her chin lifted though her heart pounded so hard it hurt, her voice trembling only slightly as she demanded to know what she had just heard. Saunders' eyes, cold steel softened by fatigue, did not waver from hers as he admitted without excuse or apology that the rumors she might have heard in whispers and headlines were true, that the blood on his shirt had been his own, but the bullet had been fired by men he had once called his brothers, that the hunt for him had been orchestrated by a rival named Corbin Moretti, who now had not only a taste for vengeance, but also, somehow, her clinic's business card, proof enough that her kindness had unknowingly tied her fate to his. Elise felt the walls close in around her, the memories of her quiet life, Patient's gentle smiles, the modest dream of keeping her small clinic alive, suddenly fragile in the presence of the man whose world was built on power and shadows. And she told him, voice raw, that he needed to leave before the danger he carried consumed them both, but Saunders shook his head, his words low, yet laced with an almost grim tenderness, as he said that if he walked out tonight, the wolves Moretti had sent would come, straight for her, seeing her not as a healer, but as leverage, and that if he stayed it would only draw fire sooner to her doorstep, because men like Moretti would burn down the very walls around them. To drag him out. The air between them thickened with a kind of stalemate neither of them wanted, and for a fleeting moment Elise glimpsed in him not the ruthless king of a criminal empire, but a man who looked almost weary of the violence that had followed him, a man who, despite his lethal aura, lowered his head slightly as he thanked her for saving his life, when she could have turned him away and spared herself the danger. It was in that quiet exchange, in the flicker of sincerity that passed through his gaze, that Elise found herself unsettled, not because she forgave his world, but because she sensed, beneath the armor of a kingpin, the raw presence of a man whose trust had been betrayed by his own. And that recognition stirred something conflicted and unwelcome in her chest. She stepped back, needing space, needing to breathe, and the moment might have stretched into something heavier, had it not been for the sudden chirp of the front doorbell, the squeaky, cheerful note that usually announced patients in need, but now felt like an intruder breaking the fragile stillness. And when Chloe, her young, bright-eyed assistant, breezed in with a stack of late-night paperwork and a bag of takeout, Elise's heart almost stopped, knowing that Chloe's cheerful curiosity was the last thing they could afford, for the girl was as observant as she was innocent. Chloe blinked at the sight of Silas and then at Saunders, who had retreated half a step into the shadows of the kitchen, her brows lifting as she began to ask a question. But before Elise could think of an explanation, Silas's expression softened into a smooth, disarming smile that seemed so out of place on his battle-scarred face as he stepped forward, and in an easy, convincing tone introduced Saunders as Elise's visiting cousin, who had been in a minor accident and was staying until he healed, his manner so natural that Chloe's cue, Curiosity shifted to concern for the supposed relative, though Elise felt her throat tighten as she murmured agreement, forcing a faint smile while her pulse hammered in her ears. Chloe, satisfied for the moment, busied herself in the corner with her paperwork. Yet Elise noticed Sonder watching her from across the room with an unreadable expression that lingered like an echo of the world he came from, and in that heavy silence beneath the hum of the clinic's old heater, Elise understood that the thin barrier between her ordinary life and the violent realm Sonder inhabited had already begun to splinter. Chloe's cheerful hum faded down the hall, her obliviousness to the tension she had almost unraveled, leaving Elise frozen by the counter as the door clicked shut behind her assistant. And in that lingering silence, Elise turned back to face Sonder, her breath caught somewhere between defiance and dread. Yet before she could speak, Silas's phone buzzed and his brows furrowed as he muttered that the news from town was bad. Moretti's men had cornered a local witness in a roadside diner and torched the place to the ground after wringing out what they wanted to know, a chilling reminder that the violence Elise had glimpsed was not confined to whispered conversations in the dark, but had already reached the edge of her quiet world. And as the words sank in, her heart hammered painfully against her ribs because the distance between her clinic and that diner was barely a half-hour's drive, and she suddenly understood that there was no longer any sanctuary in the wilderness. Sonder's gaze, steady and ice-bright, caught hers then, and his voice was low, almost roughened by something unspoken as he said, "You have two choices. Stay here and wait for them to come, or come with me for 48 hours. My people will keep you alive." And for a moment Elise could only stare at him, torn between, in fury at the audacity of being given an ultimatum in her own clinic and the cold recognition that he was speaking the truth, because if Moretti's men had her card, they would eventually arrive. And all her stubborn independence would mean nothing in the face of their brutality. Her mind spun through images of Jack's growling at strangers, of the empty road leading to her clinic, of Chloe's easy laughter that could so easily be silenced by one stray bullet, and she felt the weight of a choice she had never wanted to face pressing in until her voice came out quieter than she expected. Almost a whisper, yet carrying the firmness of a decision made under duress. She would go, not because she trusted him, but because staying meant leaving the door open for her enemies to walk through. Silas moved briskly, issuing terse orders into his earpiece, as though he had expected her answer all along, while Sonder simply inclined his head, a faint shadow of respect crossing his features as if he recognized the cost of her reluctant agreement. And minutes later, Elise was locking the clinic's door for what felt like the last time, the night pressing down heavy and cold, the moon glinting off puddles left by the earlier storm as the growl of approaching engines announced a convoy of sleek, black SUVs that rolled to a halt before her porch like silent predators. Jax, alert but surprisingly calm, stayed at her heel as one of Sonder's men opened the rear door and Elise climbed in, feeling as though she were stepping across an invisible line from the fragile safety of her old life into a shadowed world she had only glimpsed in news headlines and whispered warnings. And as the convoy pulled away, she watched her clinic recede into the darkness until it vanished behind a curve in the road, her chest tightening with an ache that felt like leaving more than a building behind, as if part of herself was being left standing there on the porch with the wind tugging at her coat. Inside the SUV, the atmosphere was taut, but not unfriendly, the faint scent of leather and steel lingering beneath the of the tires on wet asphalt, and Elise found her gaze drifting to Saunders seated beside her, his posture rigid yet betraying a subtle tension in the way one hand braced against his side where the gunshot wound still pulled at him, and in the fleeting wash of passing headlights, she caught the fine lines of strain around his mouth, and the way his jaw clenched against a spasm of pain, and that tiny crack in the formidable mask stirred something in her that she didn't want to name, a reluctant flicker of empathy for a man who carried the weight of so much violence, yet endured his injury in silence rather than admit weakness. She forced herself to look away, reminding herself that he was the reason danger had come to her door at all, but it was impossible not to be aware of the way his nearness in the confined space changed the rhythm of her own breathing, the air between them charged with unspoken wariness and something darker, less definable. Outside the window, dark forested slopes blurred past, broken only by the occasional distant glow of a farmhouse light, and Elise found her thoughts wandering to Jax, curled quietly at her feet, as if he sensed the gravity of the night, offering his steady presence without demand. And she wondered if the dog's easy acceptance of this man was a sign she should have heeded sooner. The miles stretched on in near silence, broken only by Silas's occasional low-voiced reports over the radio, and with each passing moment the reality of her situation settled more heavily in her chest. She had left everything familiar behind, and entrusted her life, however unwillingly, to a man who led an empire she had every reason to despise. When the convoy slowed to navigate a narrow mountain pass, Elise noticed the flicker of Saunders' eyelids as another wave of pain passed through him, and without thinking, she shifted slightly toward him as though to steady. Him, their eyes meeting briefly in the dim light, and for a heartbeat the world outside the SUV, the threat of Moretti, even the relentless unknown of the hours ahead seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet recognition of two people caught on the same dangerous road for very different reasons. Then the lead vehicle signaled a turn, snapping her from that fleeting connection as they descended into a valley cloaked in fog, and she felt the future pressing in once more, uncertain and treacherous. Miles behind them, as dawn began to pale the horizon, Detective Miles Croft stood in the empty clinic doorway, holding up a crumpled surgical glove speckled with dried blood, his jaw tightening as he turned it over in the weak morning light, and without a word, he slipped it into an evidence bag, his eyes hardening with the quiet resolve of a man who had just found his first real lead in a trail he intended to follow to the very end. The convoy of black SUVs wound up the narrow, pine-lined road beneath a moon obscured by heavy clouds, their headlights slicing through drifting mist as Elise sat rigid in the back seat beside Sonder, her fingers unconsciously gripping Jax's fur for reassurance, while Sonder, pale but composed, gave the occasional clipped order into his phone. The mountain loomed ahead like a silent sentinel until, after what felt like hours, the vehicles rolled past a hidden steel gate that slid open with the soft hum of machinery, revealing a sprawling estate of glass and steel perched on a cliff's edge, its reflective walls capturing the thin silver light of the night and giving it the appearance of a watchful fortress, surrounded by a forest that whispered in the cold wind. And Elise felt a shiver race down her spine as the SUVs came to a halt beneath an overhang where armed men in black tactical gear emerged from the shadows with the silent precision of soldiers, their eyes sharp and assessing. But when Silas appeared, tall and steady, his dark coat brushing the wind, his nod to her held something like respect, and she realized this place was not merely a home, but a fortress born of paranoia and necessity, a sanctuary of shadows for a man who lived in constant war. As Elise followed Sonder inside, her boots echoing against the polished concrete floors, she could not help but notice the sharp contrast between the grim-faced guards lining the halls like statues and the few who moved with quieter deference. The ones whose loyalty to Sonder seemed more personal than mercenary, and in that distinction she sensed the weight of the man's influence, not merely through fear, but through a code she had yet to understand. She was still taking in the stark, modern interior, its sweeping glass walls revealing a sea of dark pines below, when her phone buzzed unexpectedly in her pocket, startling her with its normalcy in such a charged place, and the moment she saw Chloe's name on the screen, her chest tightened. For the bright-voiced assistant who had been her one source of cheer at the clinic now sounded worried, her tone laced with a faint tremor as she asked too pointedly where Elise had gone and why she hadn't returned. A tremor that made Elise's heart stutter because it hinted Chloe knew more than she pretended to, though Elise, glancing at Saunders' profile, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon beyond the glass, kept her answers vague, promising to explain later, ending the call with a heaviness in her chest, as if an invisible tether to her former life had just grown taut. That night, as the wind rattled the steel-framed windows and Jax curled at the foot of her makeshift bed in one of the guest rooms, Elise found herself drawn to the quiet hum of voices down the corridor, and, following the sound, she entered the wide, dimly lit lounge where Sonder sat alone by the fire, its glow painting the sharp planes of his face in gold and shadow, his ice-blue eyes distant as he stared at the flames until he spoke, his voice low but dead with the weight of old scars, telling her of a boyhood cut short by the brutal murder of his father at the hands of Corbin Moretti's men, of a legacy of blood he had never wanted but had inherited. Nonetheless, and of the empire he had built not for power's sake but as a shield to end a feud that had devoured generations, his words measured yet carrying an undercurrent of something raw, unhealed, and as Elise listened, caught between disbelief and reluctant empathy, she realized that behind the ruthless reputation stood a man shaped by loss and driven by a cause he could neither abandon nor escape. Later, when she offered to change his dressing and he acquiesced with the faintest wry curve of his lips, she knelt beside him, her fingers deftly peeling away the stained bandage, cleaning and restitching the wound with practiced precision while he watched her in silence, his gaze not cold, but strangely intent. And when their hands brushed, her knuckles grazing his as she adjusted the fresh bandage, an unexpected flicker of warmth passed between them, fleeting but unmistakable, like the spark struck when steel meets flint, and it unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The moment lingered in a delicate, unspoken tension until the world outside intruded with sudden violence. A sharp, shattering crack split the night air, and a spider web of fractured glass bloomed inches from her head as a sniper's bullet punched through the window, shards spraying across the floor, and in that heartbeat Elise froze, the breath caught in her throat, before Saunders' arm shot out, pulling her down behind the heavy leather couch as Jax lunged forward with a savage growl, and the room filled with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the distant echo of retreating gunfire, the warmth of the fire now replaced by the cold realization that the fortress was not impenetrable and that the wolves hunting them had already found their trail. The echo of shattered glass still trembled through the air as armed guards fanned out across the terrace, scanning the black ridge beyond the pines where the sniper's flash had vanished, and Elise, crouched low beside the couch, felt her heart hammering so hard it hurt, her breath ragged in the charged silence until Sonder rose with a deliberate calm that made the armed men obey his clipped orders without question, his eyes glinting cold steel as he assessed the bullet's trajectory, and murmured something to Silas, who had appeared like a shadow at his side. Even as Elise's pulse raced, she saw the slight tightening in Saunders' jaw that betrayed not fear, but grim confirmation. And when he finally turned to her, his voice was low, measured, carrying the weight of a truth he had hoped to keep from her a little longer. That this was no random strike, but the work of someone inside his own syndicate, someone who had not only betrayed him, but endangered everyone under his protection, a revelation that settled over her like ice. But before she could voice the tangle of anger and disbelief rising in her chest, Silas had already begun issuing commands into his earpiece, summoning teams to trace the sniper's trail, and in the quick, efficient exchange that followed, she could feel the current of trust between the two men, unshaken even under threat, though Elise caught the faintest flicker of grief in Saunders' gaze when he muttered the name Matthias, an enforcer high in his ranks, once like a brother, now a snake in the grass feeding Moretti their every move. As Silas dispatched a counter-strike team to sweep the surrounding hills, Sonder turned back to Elise, his shoulders tense beneath the dark lines of his shirt, and urged her to remain in the estate's reinforced panic room until the immediate danger passed. But the suggestion ignited something defiant in her chest. She had spent years patching up the wounded, rescuing animals from fires and storms, and she refused to be hidden like fragile glass behind steel doors while others bled and fought on her behalf. so she squared her shoulders and met his steady gaze, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath her ribs, as she told him she wasn't going to sit in the dark and wait to be saved. And for a moment, something like reluctant admiration sparked in his eyes, a subtle softening that faded as quickly as it came, but lingered in the way his tone gentled when he told her to at least stay close to him. In the hours that followed, as the estate hummed with the quiet urgency of a war council, and Silas coordinated the counterstrike through a network of radios and encrypted calls, Elise found herself moving with silent purpose through the shadowed halls, tending to one of the guards grazed by splintered glass, her hands steady despite her still thudding heart. And when she finally paused to catch her breath in the corner of a dimly lit corridor, Sonder appeared, his presence filling the narrow space not with threat, but with an unexpected warmth as he murmured his thanks for her courage, the sincerity in his voice disarming her more than any sharp retort could have. And in that fleeting moment, as the cold mask of the Mafia king slipped to reveal the weary, guarded man beneath, Elise felt her own defenses falter just enough to wonder if she had misjudged the entirety of him. Yet the fragile moment was broken by the insistent buzz of her phone, and when she saw Chloe's name on the screen, relief was quickly replaced by dread, as the young woman's normally cheerful voice sounded taut, strained, and behind the strained words, Elise could hear the distant murmur of another voice, one that made her blood run cold as Chloe faltered under Detective Miles Croft's quiet but relentless questioning, his insinuations laced with the kind of confidence that comes from having already pieced together too much of the truth. And though Chloe tried to play her part, Elise knew that Croft was circling closer, like a predator scenting blood in the water, making the line between the law and the underworld more treacherous than ever. As she ended the call with a murmured reassurance that sounded hollow even to her own ears, Elise turned and froze just outside the war room, where Sonder and Silas stood in the glow of the monitors, their voices low but sharp, and her breath caught as she heard Silas say, "Matthias knows about her. He'll use her to get to you," the words striking her like a physical blow, chilling her with the sudden realization that the danger clawing at their walls wasn't merely about bullets and ambushes. It was personal now, a hunt with her life as the bait. Saunders stood in the dimly lit war room beneath his mountain estate, the air thick with the weight of grim decisions as Silas's last words still echoed in his mind about Matthias knowing too much, his icy blue eyes reflecting the simmering storm inside him while Elise lingered near the doorway, her heart hammering as she realized the silent battle in the man's mind. And after a long breath, Sonder finally spoke in a voice like gravel over steel, declaring that he would end this war before it swallowed more lives, even if it meant stepping directly into the lion's den. He spread a rough map of the region across the table, tracing a finger to a desolate quarry surrounded by dead pines where the syndicate's traitor, Matthias, was rumored to frequent, his tone resolute, yet carrying a trace of something Elise had never heard before, weariness, as though the weight of countless lost nights and broken promises had begun to crack the iron shell around him, and though Silas objected, warning that Moretti would never send Matthias alone, Saunders' jaw clenched with finality as he declared that the game needed to end, not just for power or revenge, but to stop the bloodshed once and for all, while Elise stood frozen in the corner, torn between admiration for his resolve and fear for his life, her hands tightening around the edge of the doorframe as she realized she could not stand aside. He walked into a trap. Later that night, when the convoy rolled out beneath a moon like a shard of silver in a blackened sky, Elise made a decision that surprised even herself, slipping out of the estate's safety and following the dark armored vehicles on a smaller trail bike, her breath fogging in the mountain cold as the pines closed in like tall, silent sentries, the gravel cracking under her tires, while her heart pounded against her ribs with every mile closer to the inevitable confrontation. And when she finally saw the ghostly lights flickering in the distance of the quarry, and the faint outlines of Saunders' men blending into the shadows of crumbling concrete and rusted machinery, she crouched low, clutching the rough strap of her satchel as she crept closer. the metallic scent of old blood and oil filling the air like a memory that refused to die. Meanwhile, Saunders stood at the quarry's heart, framed by jagged stone and the skeletal remains of machines left to rust decades ago. His broad shoulders squared as his voice rang out in the hollow space, calling for Matthias to show himself, each word carrying the weight of history, betrayal, rage, and the memory of his father's murder, until, from the darkness beyond the shattered loader, Matthias emerged, wearing a twisted grin that revealed not just arrogance, but an almost unhinged delight at seeing the man he once called his brother now standing exposed, and he began to speak with a snake's smoothness, mocking Saunders' iron rule and calling him a man undone by a single weakness, his growing attachment to a simple veterinarian, words that cut through the night and struck Elise like a thunderbolt as she crouched in the shadows, her breath catching at the realization that their enemy had noticed the bond between her and the man who once seemed untouchable. But before she could process the depth of that danger, the quarry exploded into chaos as a gunshot cracked the silence, ricocheting off the rusted crane overhead, and then the whole scene descended into a maelstrom of muzzle flashes and shouting. The air thick the acrid bite of gunpowder as Sonder and Silas's men returned fire from behind the boulders, and Elise, shaking with both terror and determination, crawled along the gravel-strewn edge until she saw Matthias lining up his sights on Saunders' exposed flank as he reloaded, her heart slamming against her ribs as instinct overrode fear, and she snatched up a rock, hurling it with all the force she could muster at the sheet of corrugated metal near Matthias, the sharp clang throwing off his aim just enough for Sonder to dive for cover, the bullet sparking harmlessly against the quarry floor as Matthias cursed and swung toward the source of the distraction, only to be met by Silas's sudden appearance from the side, his movements as precise and unyielding as a predator closing in for the kill, and in the next heartbeat, a flash of steel and a muffled cry ended the traitor's treachery with brutal finality, but not before Matthias, bleeding out on the cold ground, used his last ragged breath to spit out a warning that froze the blood in Elise's veins and made Saunders' entire stance stiffen. Moretti knew where to strike next. The victory in that bleak, starlit quarry tasted of ash as the realization sank in that the syndicate leader had already set his next move in motion, and as the echoes of gunfire faded and the men gathered in grim silence around the fallen traitor, a sharp vibration in Silas's pocket broke the heavy stillness, the glow of his phone screen casting pale light on his scarred face as his expression shifted from stoic control to something dark and urgent. And when he passed the phone to Sonder, Elise could see the way his jaw locked and his eyes hardened like steel tempered in fire as he read the brief, chilling message. Moretti had taken Chloe, the gentle friend who had been Elise's anchor in the storm, kidnapped to be used as leverage in this brutal war, and sign. In that moment, as the cold mountain wind whipped through the quarry carrying the scent of smoke and fear, Elise felt the full weight of what they were up against, the fragile thread of safety that had bound them already fraying, as Saunders' voice, low but edged with a promise of retribution, cut through the darkness, vowing that this war would not claim another innocent soul. The moment the call came in, reporting that Chloe had been abducted by Moretti's men, the air inside the mountain estate turned heavy and electric, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Elise, still streaked with the dust of the quarry, pushed past Silas before anyone else could speak, her voice steady, but eyes shining with a fierce, unshakable resolve, as she declared that she would go with them, no longer a bystander to the blood-soaked war that had already changed her life. And though Saunders' first instinct was to refuse, the memory of her standing unflinching in the sniper's sights, and later saving his life in the quarry came back to him, so he simply gave a short nod that made her chest tighten, and orders went out to prepare the convoy for the rescue as the night deepened around them. Elise hurried to gather her medical kit, Jax pacing beside her as if he too understood the gravity of the mission ahead. while outside the estate's floodlights cast long, sharp shadows over the armored SUVs that lined up like sentinels ready to plunge into the storm-slick wilderness. The drive down from the mountains was silent except for the hum of engines and the occasional roll of distant thunder. And in the back seat, between the intermittent flickers of lightning, Elise caught glimpses of Saunders' face, grim, focused, yet carrying the faintest crease of worry that he couldn't entirely mask, reminding her that beneath the iron-willed leader was a man whose scars went deeper than the bullet wound she had once stitched. When they reached the mist-wrapped lake where Moretti's hideout lay hidden, Silas leaned forward to brief them on the layout he'd pieced together from intercepted comm. Unications. His tone clipped but betraying the urgency of a man who had come to respect the woman they were about to save. And Elise, gripping her kit tightly, fought down the gnawing anxiety in her chest by reminding herself that Chloe had been brave enough to cover for her back at the clinic. This was the moment to repay that loyalty. Rain swept sideways as they disembarked in the dark, and Elise stayed close to Sonder as his men fanned out, their shadows darting like wraiths between the tall reeds and rusted boathouses, until the first exchange of suppressed gunfire cracked the night, followed by the deeper roar of rifles as Moretti's sentries discovered the breach. Elise kept low behind the cover of a toppled skiff, her breath shallow as she tried to focus on what she could do, stabilize the wounded, keep people alive, while above the gunfire she caught sight of Silas breaking away with two men toward a shack at the edge of the dock where they believed Chloe was being held, his figure cutting through the rain with grim determination. Then, from the upper balcony of the main lakeside lodge, a tall figure emerged beneath the flare of a burning lantern, and Elisa's heart lurched as she recognized Corbin Moretti, sharp-featured, cold-eyed, calling down a taunt to Sonder that echoed across the water, mocking his rival for being shackled by sentiment, daring him to cross the dock alone if he wanted the girl back, and without hesitation, Sonder stepped forward through the sheets of rain as if he carried his own storm with him, tossing his rifle aside to answer the challenge. Elise watched, barely breathing, as the two men met at the center of the slick wooden planks, their collision more like the clash of beasts than men, fists and elbows cutting arcs through the downpour, the wet boards beneath them splintering beneath their weight, while the battle raged around them, and for a terrifying moment Elise thought Moretti's heavier frame and brutal strikes might overwhelm Sonder, until she saw the familiar glint in his eyes, a fierce, unbroken will. And when Moretti lunged for a blade dropped from one of his fallen men, Elise reacted on pure instinct, shouting a warning and hurling a metal wrench she'd found near the dock at his arm, giving Sonder the split second he needed to twist the weapon away and drive his opponent back against a piling with a final, decisive blow that left Moretti sprawled in the rain, groaning, defeated but alive. In that breathless silence after the fight, with the storm still raging above, Sonder stood over his rival, chest heaving, and then, to the surprise of his own men, stepped back, declaring hoarsely that the cycle of blood ended here, that he would not become the same monster who had once taken his father from him, before signaling his men to cuff Moretti and drag him inside to negotiate the terms of a truce that would cripple the other man's empire without another death. Meanwhile, Silas emerged from the shack carrying Chloe, damp but unharmed save for a bruise on her temple, and Elise rushed to her side, checking her vitals with brisk professionalism even as her voice softened with relief, while Chloe, in a moment of shaken candor, confessed to Elise that her own father had once owed allegiance to Moretti's crew and that she had long feared her past might catch up with her, but that now she wanted nothing more than to stand by the woman who had treated her like family. By the time the convoy rolled back toward the mountains, the rain had softened to a mist, and the first pale light of dawn was breaking over the lake, glinting off the wet roads as if rinsing the bloodshed of the night away. And Elise, sitting beside Chloe in the rear vehicle, stared at the back of Saunders' head in the SUV ahead, feeling a complicated swell of emotions: gratitude for her friend's rescue, awe at the man who had spared an enemy when vengeance had been his for the taking, and a deeper, quieter ache she could not quite name. Returnin' G to the clinic felt like stepping into another life, the walls familiar yet somehow smaller than before, as if the world outside had forever changed her. And Chloe, still pale but smiling faintly, insisted on staying to help rebuild what had been lost and to repay the loyalty Elise had once shown her. Later that evening, as dusk painted the wilderness in shades of gold and ash, Sonder arrived without an escort, limping slightly, yet carrying himself with the same quiet authority. And when Elise opened the door, she was struck by how different he looked in the softer light, still dangerous, still carved by violence, but with something gentler in his eyes. A shadow of weariness mingled with unspoken gratitude. They did not speak much as he walked past her into the clinic's modest reception, pausing only to take a small black ring from his pocket, the insignia of the syndicate, and set it down on the counter with a low murmur that held both promise and farewell. "If you ever need me, you know how to call the wolf." Elise could only nod, her throat tight, as she watched him turn and step out into the rain-specked night, climbing into the waiting SUV that rumbled softly before rolling down the gravel road toward the horizon, where a storm still lingered. And as the red taillights dwindled into the distance, she felt an ache she hadn't anticipated, a pull between the peace she had always sought in her quiet practice and the fierce, untamed force that had entered her life with a gunshot and a plea for sanctuary. Outside, Jax padded to the door and lay down, his head resting on his paws, but his ears pricked toward the distant sound of engines, as though he, too, waited for the wolf's return, while Elise stood for a long moment in the doorway, watching the storm clouds scatter across the horizon, her heart heavy yet oddly hopeful, knowing that the bond forged in that crucible of danger and trust would not easily fade, even as the wilderness around her returned to its hush.